Good afternoon. I'm Robert Litvak, Senior Vice President at the Wilson Center. I'd like to welcome those in attendance here at the center in Washington, D.C., and then also a warm welcome to those watching on C-SPAN. 50 years ago this month, Congress passed legislation creating the Wilson Center as the nation's official memorial to our 28th president. But rather than erect a statue on the Mall, Congress created the Wilson Center as a living memorial whose mission is to serve as a bridge between academia and public policy. Wilson, our only president with a PhD, believed the policymaker could learn from the scholar and vice versa. The center fulfills this mission through in-depth research and dialogue to inform actionable ideas on global issues. In 2013, the centenary of Wilson's inauguration as president, the Wilson Center sponsored a conference on Wilson's legacy. Next month marks the centenary of the end of World War I, and in December, Wilson's departure for Paris, the first European trip by an American president to head the delegation to the peace conference. Against this historical backdrop, and in celebration of the Wilson Center's 50th anniversary, we are returning this afternoon to the question of Wilson's legacy with two panels exploring the relevance of President Wilson's international and domestic record for today. Most historians rank Wilson as one of the 6 most important presidents, behind the 3 greats, Lincoln, Washington, and Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and with 2 other near greats, Theodore Roosevelt and Jefferson. At our conference 5 years ago, historian Michael Kazin said that, quote, Wilson is full of contradictions. In some ways, he might be the most complicated and contradictory president we've ever had, close quote. Thomas Knock, one of the great Wilson scholars who's with us today, said, quote, Wilson is neither very fondly remembered nor well understood by most Americans, close quote. Our purpose today is to improve that understanding by looking back at Wilson's record, both positive and negative, as well as forward to assess his continuing relevance. In the first panel, we'll explore the extent to which the 28th president's vision for world order is still applicable, given all the profound shifts currently roiling the international system. The second panel, which Professor John Milton Cooper will chair, will examine the lessons will examine his domestic policy accomplishments and failures. I'm delighted that for the 2 panels today, we've assembled a distinguished array of experts, including several prominent Wilson alumni. They will shed light on these important issues today. A special word of thanks to John Milton Cooper, who is the Dean of Wilson Historians, for his counsel in organizing today's conference. I will turn now to our first panel, and I will switch seats. Switch to a seat and a different microphone. The topic is, will the world order Wilson Envisioned survive? And we're fortunate to have with us a distinguished panel whose biographies have been distributed. Baroness Catherine Ashton, who was the former High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, essentially the European Union's foreign minister. We're delighted she's joined us to chair our Global Europe program at the Wilson Center. Mitchell Reese is President and CEO of the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Station identification is a great place to visit. So go down and have the colonial experience there. He's also former Director of Policy Planning at the State Department. And then Trig Trontveit, who is a historian at the University of Minnesota. He's the author of Power Without Victory, Woodrow Wilson, and the American Internationalist Experiment. Now, unfortunately, Jeffrey Talifaro of Tufts University, who was on the program, is unable to be with us today due to illness. We're going to conduct this in kind of conversational format for a half hour or so, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for your comments and questions. Let's just jump right in on, I think, an obvious starting point, the nature of Wilsonianism. As a scholar, Wilson was a domestic political scientist. But as president, he is best known for his internationalism. So what is Wilsonianism? Wilson's vision was developed in a particular historical context. What was that vision a century ago as he headed to Europe at the end of World War I? What did Wilson mean when he spoke of, quote, peace without victory, close quote? And we're going to turn first to Trigg. Your book is a clever play on Wilson's phrase. It's not peace without victory. It's called power without peace. So why don't you start in on, set us straight as we try to increase our understanding of what Wilson was and how his name has been used and abused, tackle that set of questions that I posed on the nature of Wilsonianism.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for being here, and those watching on C-SPAN, thank you as well for tuning in. I'm going to start by answering your question by responding to the panel title, which is, my answer is going to sound gloomier maybe than it is. No, the order that Wilson envisioned will not survive, because it actually was never realized in the first place. I think one of the easy ways in today's sort of discourse to get at what Wilsonianism was is to get at what it wasn't. It was not what occurred from 1945 through the end of the Cold War, which is not to pass any sort of judgment on the foreign policy of that period. It's just to say that the post-war architecture established after 1945, for all of its virtues, was at the same time designed to entrench certain legal and political and economic privileges for the United States to maintain its dominant position. That was as close to the opposite of Wilson's vision as you could get. Wilson's vision, which did emerge from his study of domestic political science, both in the United States and all across Europe — he was quite an accomplished comparativist — was to substitute discussion for fighting, because that's what groups of peoples had done all across the planet for centuries in order to stabilize their societies and manage their affairs with the minimum of bloodshed and chaos. He didn't envision endless discussion, just an endless debating society. He envisioned government by discussion, which ended with a vote, which ended usually, although not always, with winners and losers, but with the process preceding it that was hopefully mutually educative, shaping the outcome in ways that maybe neither party had completely envisioned at the outset, and in a way that preserved the process, did as little violence, and in fact hopefully bolstered the process enough so that the losers were invested in coming back to the process the next time. And that was his vision for the League of Nations. There was no equivalent to, for instance, the Security Council veto in the League Covenant that Wilson drew up. He was pressured by the US Senate and by his European counterparts to write unanimity as the general voting rule in the League Covenant, but then he very cleverly inserted all sorts of workarounds for specific issues, because he thought that was to undermine the whole purpose of a league, which was to prevent one nation, simply because of its power or pretensions, from thwarting the will of the entire world and endangering its peace. I don't think that kind of an order has been established. I think there are certain aspects of our international institutions and international society that work desperately to enact that sort of an ethos, but they face sort of grave structural barriers that were very intentionally built in to the post-1945 architecture. And I'll leave it at that. I have some opinions too on self-determination and its place or lack of place in a description of Wilsonianism, but maybe we can get back to that.
That's a really good setup for us. I mean, when we think of Wilson, typically he's referred to as an idealist. He's sometimes referred to as sort of an architect of the liberal international order, and we'll come back to that in the conversation. And that's one of two in international relations, at least as it's taught in the academy, one of two schools of thought that help us think about international relations and come to this, address the most fundamental question is like, how do you achieve international peace? As your comments, Trig, kind of reflected, democratic governance mattered. The domestic structures mattered to Wilson, and we associate him with this school that if we proliferate democracies with market economies, that is a pathway to a Pacific international system, and it's got lineage going back into philosophy to Kant. The alternative model, often called realism, I mean, their answer, the realist answer to the riddle, how do you achieve international peace, is not replicate democratic governance, but rather create a stable distribution of power between states. And your comment reflected that at the end of World War II, we had this two-track international system. In the West, there was a sort of core community of democratic states with market economies. And in the East, you had authoritarian regimes. And NATO was created really in the realist tradition, the organization that Kathy was centrally involved in. The European Union was in the other tradition. So we've got this sort of two-track international system. Let's just stick with the democratic piece of it first. And there's debate about what Wilson thought power should do to promote democracy. Both Kathy and Mitchell were involved in democracy promotion and in their prior policy jobs. And John Milton Cooper, the Wilson biographer, who's the dean of Wilson biographers, he's pointed out that Wilson did not write, quote, the United States should make the world safe for democracy, close quote. Instead, and he was an excellent writer and wrote with power and clarity, instead Wilson used the passive voice, quote, the world must be made safe for democracy, close quote. Now, I don't like Kathy and Mitchell to explore, what does that formulation mean? You know, the role of democracy promotion, how important that is to creating a Pacific international order, and really, I think most importantly for policymakers coming from countries with democratic governance, where should we put our money where our mouth is? What should we do to promote it? And both of you were involved in. Kathy, why don't we begin with you? You had a host of experiences in Eastern Europe. You were there as foreign minister, during the Arab Spring. So give us your take.
I think you have to begin by defining what you mean by democracy. One of the issues that I came across a great deal, and my guess is that you had the same, is that democracy in the eyes of people who look at nations like yours in the US or mine in Britain and the European context, they see elections. And so they equate democratic action with elections, rather than understanding that there is a huge amount, and Margaret Macmillan, who's already been cited in our earlier conversations, writes very eloquently about this in her book on the First World War, this sort of web of different organizations and structures that create the capacity to have elections is really what democracy is about. And it took my country a long time. I often would say to leaders in different countries, it's 700 years since Magna Carta. Most of that time, people who look like me couldn't vote. It's not a process that is a straight line. It's a process that is very complicated and difficult. And it's the cherry on the icing on the cake when you finally get to the point of an election. And so one of the challenges that I think those of us promoting democracy as the best way of organizing society to the benefit of people is to get people to understand what it means. It's also important in the context of elections to make the obvious point, which is the purpose of elections is to throw governments out. That's what it's for. It's not necessarily to vote them in, because often when you vote, you're not quite sure what you're going to get. You may get a straightforward first past the post, you may get a coalition, you may get all kinds of things. But the next time you vote, you have the power to get rid of. And that, I think, is really significant and important for people to understand. It also means that democracy is about making sure that you have effective opposition. And in many countries that are going through democratic transformations, at the beginning of the process. And even further down the road, it is still winner takes all. And you don't have a government in waiting being created at the same time, which of course is such an important part of the democratic process too. So democracy and elections get mixed up. We need to promote democracy in all the senses of that.
In America, the governments in waiting are based at think tanks, Kathy. So, Mitchell.
Well, thank you, Rob. Thank you for inviting me here today. And thank you, Rob, for inviting me years ago to be a guest scholar at the Wilson Center. It was 4 of the happiest years I can remember. And
I rescued you from a legal practice.
you did rescue me. I'm a lapsed lawyer.
A legal quake.
And I also want to congratulate everybody at the Wilson Center. 50 years of a remarkable institution. The board leadership is absolutely crucial. And you really are the best think tank in the country, if not in the entire world. It's just a remarkable institution. And so I wanted to just acknowledge that. And I want to answer the question by doing a very Wilson Center type of thing, which is to create really a template of democracy promotion behavior. And so if we imagine what that might look like, and I think it's easier then to understand the actions of certain leaders, including Wilson, and really pick up on something that Kathy just said. And so at one end of the spectrum of democracy promotion is imposing democracy by military intervention. Okay, there's no democracy pre-existing in the country, you impose it. And Iraq is the most recent example of that. And only slightly less difficult is militarily intervening in a country and restoring democracy that had lapsed in the country. And we saw that in Eastern Europe after the Cold War, where it was restored. It's both of those sort of sit at one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum is what you might call the United States is the shining city on the hill as an example only, or what might be termed benign indifference. And there's a wonderful quote from Thomas Jefferson's first inaugural that sort of sums it up. It says, "What he wishes for the United States going forward is peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none." Okay, it's often attributed to Washington's farewell address, was actually Thomas Jefferson. So those are the two poles, and in between lies a tremendous menu of options for policymakers and for countries. And it really does pick up on what Kathy was saying, whether it is USIA programs, whether it is radio-free entities, Radio Free Europe or North Korea, whether it's covert support for democratic forces like the United States provided to Italy after World War II, the color revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine, appointing special envoys to the trouble spots to focus attention, even funding women's education, again, empowering people who don't have voices to have more voices in their daily lives, and then Millennium Challenge Corporation, where you incentivize good governance. There's a whole range of democracy promotion. We tend to only think of either doing nothing or militarily intervening, when in fact there's a rich menu, and depending on the time, the preferences of the institution, the administration, and the will of the American people, we use all of them. Thank you.
Can I?
And conditionality was used to the European Union, right, as a way for new members to promote democratic governance, civil-military relations. Was that, how was that tool kind of conceived in the European Union context?
Well, in the context of those who wanted to join the European Union, there was a whole set of conditions to be met. The alignment of judicial programs, the economic move to a market economy and all of that. And, of course, ensuring that you had democratic institutions that operated in support of a democratic future. And for those countries who were not wanting to join, or who perhaps the EU would never consider to be potential members, much more about ensuring that where they were clearly looking for a democratic future, that resources and funding, exactly as Michael has said, were put in search of helping them to create the circumstances where they could do it. And it encompasses, as you rightly say, all sorts of things that you would put into that basket of possibilities, a kind of pick and mix menu in a way, depending on the circumstances, and also the circumstances that people found themselves in. One of the really difficult elements of this is it's quite hard to stop people rushing away thinking here is the moment to grab a democratic future when they don't have all of these things in place. And I can remember, for example, being in Tahrir Square after the revolution in Egypt, meeting people who had gone to register their political party, lots of them. They had probably 3 members, if that. But the potential for what they could do was enormous. The trouble was it was going to take quite some time until all of those parties evolved into something that would look like a sensible framework for having a democratic dialogue, not just in the streets of Cairo, but in a huge country with a population that was watching what was happening in Cairo with a level of amusement that was also being seen across the world.
That's great. And Mitchell gave us a great typology of kind of pathways to, how people think about pathways to democratic governance from imposed to kind of more benign. But Trig, did you want to comment on that? And
I just wanted to highlight a couple what I thought were very Wilsonian comments or characteristics of the comments made by both my colleagues. The quotation that you began with, the world must be made safe for democracy. If you read further, he says, and America must join that fight. And then the key ending is, as but one of the champions of the rights of mankind. And I think when we're talking about Wilson and democracy promotion, we have to keep 2 things in mind. One is he was much more concerned with the relations among states, at least in his mature foreign policy vision, than he was on relations within them. Not because he didn't think that this web of democratic institutions and layers were unimportant, but because he had learned, and this is the second thing to keep in mind, through trial and error and some disastrous foreign policies, that imposing democracy as an outside power doesn't work. And he had learned through the neutrality period that benign indifference doesn't work either. And in order to make, I think, credible selections among the whole menu of options that you have to somehow establish your credibility as an actor with a right to make those tough decisions. And the League of Nations was Wilson's way to give the so-called self-styled democracies some credibility. If they had a way to make these tough decisions about their role in international politics that was deliberative and at least partially open in its character, he truly felt success was a lot more likely. And it's why I think it's very important to recall that Wilson was not an advocate of self-determination. He was not an advocate of everyone in the world getting their own polity. He was an advocate of deliberative structures of governance.
well, that was exactly where I was going next, because he is identified in sort of the short answer student quiz. People would write in national self-determination as being identified with Wilson. World War I, of course, led to the creation of newly independent states from the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires. But not every national group got a state. And as one scholar has observed, national self-determination is impossible to argue with in principle, but impossible to implement in practice. And how can this tension between principle and practice be managed? How should we think about who is entitled to a state? And I'll ask Kathy and Mitchell to comment on cases they were involved with where national groups were asserting kind of their right to a state. And then Trig, I'd like you just to come in at the end and sort of set us straight on what Wilson really thought about national self-determination and how Wilson conceived of managing this tension between principle and practice. I'll start with Kathy, because you were actually involved with the creation of a state in the Balkans, your experience there with Kosovo. The Russians have come back afterwards and said they were very unhappy with that precedent and saying that Crimea and Abkhazia and Ossetia and Georgia, they should be considered states too if Kosovo could be. Talk about like your experience with Kosovo and how you how as a practitioner you kind of make these distinctions between principle and practice.
It's the classic fudge between self-determination and territorial integrity. And anyone who works around the UN will know that that is a constantly shifting theme in discussion, because it's often in all our interests to try and hold states together. Not every part of a country that wishes to be independent is viable as an independent state. And you see that, discussions in Britain about Scotland, you see discussions in Spain about Catalonia, and so on. There are lots and lots of conversations that constantly run around the theme of, should we actually separate from the country to which we are attached because we believe that we are different? And you will see the response of states and groups of states to try and deal with that. The situation in Kosovo was different because it came from a terrible struggle, awful conflict that you can trace back in conversations with leaders to the Battle of Kosovo of 1389. And in my negotiations between Serbia and Kosovo, people would be very mindful of this long and difficult history between peoples and the consequences that the Kosovars believed for themselves. The creation of Kosovo is still an ongoing thing because as such they're not yet a UN state. But in the eyes of the people in Kosovo, they are, as far as they're concerned, a country, and they are recognized by many countries as such. The challenge then becomes, for those of us who engage with it, is how do you move the situation forward? And how do you try and work to recognize that when you have an unresolved issue, it's very easy for it to translate into a frozen conflict. What you see in Georgia, where I had a monitoring mission that worked constantly to look at what was happening in South Ossetia and Abkhazia every day, you saw that things were not moving, that there was not really an opportunity to find a solution. And that, my guess, I'm no longer in office, but my guess is that the work still goes on and still doesn't find resolution. And so the challenge when you have these issues that have gone beyond the cri de coeur to desire a separation and actually have become in some senses the reality on the ground, is how do you then try and move it on and resolve it rather than leave it to be a frozen conflict. And the reason that matters is because in frozen conflicts other countries play. They use them to prevent other things from happening. You are unable to get economic growth and development and investment and all of the things that people need, and you're unable for the people of that fledgling country, if I put it like that, to take their place in any institutions or indeed in a regional context. So for me, one of the most important things that's under discussion now, especially in the Western Balkans, is trying to make sure that we move all the countries forward into what should be their European future.
Mitchell, I see kind of a contrast between, interesting contrast between the two Bushes, and you served in the second, the George W. Bush administration. But in 1991, George H.W. Bush and James Baker tried to hold Yugoslavia together, and they didn't want it to fracture along nationalist lines, unsuccessfully. After 2003, the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, wanted to hold Iraq together, and a group that many have argued deserves to have their own state, the Kurds,
right.
Were pushing hard for it. So how do you view this sort of this tension between principle and practice, and draw on the cases you were involved in?
So you mentioned Kurdistan, which is still an ongoing issue, but there's some others. If I can just add it up, it's really quite a collection. Palestine and the Palestinians, Taiwan, Kashmir, and the not so recent past, the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, and today Ukraine and whatever we want to call Eastern Ukraine with the Russian intervention. So the challenge, if I could just express, I think the same concept that Kathy identified a little differently, is how do you move these conflicts from the military realm into a diplomatic process? And that really is the challenge that states have that want to try and improve the situation. As long as there's fighting on the ground, or people trying to create new facts on the ground, set territorial lines, impose their will, it's going to be problematic to reach any, to really reach any type of resolution that is satisfactory. So how do you persuade people to stop fighting and to accept a modus vivendi, less than perfect, but the fighting stopped and now the talking began? And perhaps that is what Wilson was really looking after from everything that Trigg has said so far this afternoon. So that's, I think, the challenge of diplomacy is how do you get them to stop shooting and start talking to each other? And how do you get that to continue as long as possible? There's no way to resolve these tensions, really.
Yeah.
It's just how do you make it less deadly, and how do you at least create an opportunity for there to be a peaceful resolution?
Well, the Wilson Center, you know, an aspect of our mission is to kind of look at Wilsonianism in all of its dimension, you know, international, domestic. And Tony Smith from Tufts had a book a new book on Wilson, where he was trying to reclaim kind of Wilsonianism and to eschew sort of the attributes that have been, the activism that's been attributed to it. And I take it you're very much, you're close to that view, Trigg, in terms of on issues of democracy promotion and implementation of national self-determination.
Yes, I think we read the long Cold War period differently, but I think we're in sympathy as far as the need to inject, the need to find a better mix of boldness and humility in U.S. foreign policy. So, which is another way to say, to think of maybe some empathy in foreign policy, to try at least cognitive empathy, to put yourself in others' positions and roles. I think in that regard we are more in sync. I think, you know, I want to respond to the quotation once again that you started with, and these have been very well chosen. I think self-determination, it is completely possible to argue with that principle. I think the United States is an extended argument against the principle of ethnic self-determination. And that was the history and the culture that informed Wilson's thinking. He was a civic nationalist. Now, he was very blind in the application of his civic nationalism, as I'm sure we'll talk about later this afternoon, in terms of who was incorporated in that civic circle. But I think the principle that Wilson promoted was civic nationalism, which is, it is much more important for everybody to learn to contain their differences, ideally even work through them, but at least contain them and invest in a structure in which they can interact and manage their affairs productively, than to take this sort of vociferous route where we're constantly hiving off into tribes, because that's a infinitely replicable approach. There are always going to be differences when you have people working in groups, even if they start out thinking they're all on the same team. For Wilson, self-determination was an option in instances where one people had so violently oppressed, or many peoples had so violently oppressed others, that it really seemed that there was no way to root the types of institutions that Kathy and Mitchell have been talking about, Poland being the example. It needed its own state because it had been a pawn for so many powers, or to prevent future wars, or because of facts on the ground. Austria-Hungary, Wilson accepted all of the states that were spun out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire because they had constituted themselves as states, basically, by the time the war was over. But it's important to recognize that his general principle was finding structures and processes, just as have been noted, to bring people together and to work through, or at least manage, their differences. Because as we know in this country, these differences are sometimes impossible to resolve. Yeah. We deal with that in this country every day.
Well, that phrase, peace without victory, both Kathy and Mitchell on the policy positions you've come up with, on the Iran nuclear deal, Northern Ireland, other issues you've been involved with, the notion that that both sides have to have some stake in an outcome, and you can't have a kind of an imposed kind of peace. And I'm sure, well, I surmise that if he'd lived, Wilson would have regretted how Versailles got implemented and led, on top of a global depression, to the rise of fascism in Germany and the roots of the pathway to World War II.
Yeah, I titled the book Power Without Victory because I think he saw that the United States had chosen to protect its sovereignty and to choose a path to power rather than peace. And it was without victory because look at what happened a generation later.
Right. Well, you've again anticipated, the word sovereignty, and assertive nationalism and sovereignty that are linked opens the door to my last question, which is in kind of, has two components to it. And meanwhile, all of you can please be thinking of your smart questions, or even some short comments that you'll put question marks at the end of.
As my professor always told me, there are no smart questions.
Yeah. Or you make a comment and then just say, "Do you agree with me?" as a question. And so I've seen that tactic too at the Wilson Center. Anne Marie Slaughter, who was involved in our 2013 conference on Wilson, she had been in the State Department's policy planning staff, academic at Princeton, observed that, did a nice phrase, quote, "We live in the house that Wilson built," close quote, by which she meant that the global order has a foundation of international institutions embodying global norms, including for human rights, and that Wilson's vision that democratic governance and free markets backed by a commitment to collective security would create a Pacific international system, that vision was substantially realized. Most dramatically in Europe, where Europe in the first half of the 20th century was a death machine, and in the second half of this 20th century created unprecedented peace and prosperity. That was the vision. There's been, since the end of the Cold War, the threat of what policymakers and academics worried about traditionally, which was the threat of interstate conflict between major powers. And during the Cold War, with the notable kind of near close call at the Cuban Missile Crisis and Berlin, the risk of interstate conflict has been low since the end of the Cold War. But let's discuss, before turning over to the audience, two challenges to that order. One from within and one from without. And the first is, within the democratic community itself, one sees the trends in America and in Britain with Brexit, in America with the rise of an administration whose moniker is America First, kind of a turning inward, linked to a concept of sovereignty and controlling outcomes on a national basis. In Eastern Europe, you have worrisome rising authoritarianism in certain countries and authoritarianism abroad. You know the countries I'm talking about. Kathy, let's jump in. Let's start with you on that. Much of your career as diplomat was kind of based in at an aggregate level. You worked in Britain as a politician, but your portfolio in foreign policy was at the most aggregated level. And how you view that, the challenge within the democratic community itself now.
God, these questions are really hard. Can I just say that? So I think let me start from a Britain perspective, which is, I think you have to differentiate between a Britain that, for a whole set of reasons to do with perception as well as some realities about Brussels, this thing called Brussels, took a decision to leave the European Union, but that no politician in Britain, in the mainstream at least, has ever suggested that Britain should turn its back on the rest of the world. Indeed, it's trying to create its global Britain foreign policy. It's very engaged with NATO, very engaged at the UN, with the Security Council, and nobody talks about ending any kind of trade agreement. Quite the opposite. We have people running around the world trying to work out how many trade deals we can get in as short a time as possible. So it's not, from a British context, an inward-looking act of itself. It's an act that one can argue takes Britain further away from being able to be a global actor, because it takes away the most obvious collaboration, and there are no issues which you can solve alone anymore. You have to collaborate, and a collaboration that through its structures Britain played an important role in, and also got its issues onto the table whenever it wanted to. So you can argue that it is an inward-looking consequence, but it was not, for many people anyway, an inward-looking act. It was, we don't want to be told what to do by somebody else anymore, thank you, but we want to have our own trade deals, be our own global actor. What you see as well when you look beyond that into Europe is a consequence of all sorts of things that are happening, and it would take a lot longer than we've got this afternoon to go into them, but let me just pick up one or two. One is that for Eastern European nations who have not been part of the growth of the EU from the 1950s onwards, they are still relatively new in this organisation, and arguably have a perception and a view of Europe that is not necessarily the same as the view held by the longest standing members of the European Union. They also know that alliances that look on a Monday morning to be set to stay forever can disappear by the end of Tuesday afternoon. They know
Via Twitter?
via all kinds of means, but they know that there are things that don't necessarily remain because they were part of Soviet Union that disappeared. And nobody, I don't think, expected it would happen when it did or as quickly as it did. So there is a sense too that as nations they want to see their own versions of strong governments. And there are challenges that come from those countries back to Brussels. In Hungary, the winning team, led by Prime Minister Orban, I think used Brussels no as a slogan, and a very successful one, because it galvanized people to have a common enemy in that sense. So there are lots and lots of different things that are going on, which you, I think, have to look at on an individual basis, and I'm not suggesting you're doing this, Rob, and not kind of put together, because they are a consequence of different things happening over the years that have kind of come together.
Yeah, I think it's, there's much discussion now that we, with these changes that are in a sense response to kind of the consequences of globalization and how social identity in countries are changing, terrorism as a threat, that we shouldn't lose sight of, that essentially our winning formula, since World War II has been creating this community, and that narrative needs to be defended now kind of more than ever. Not as sort of, it's not a plug for the status quo, because it needs to change and adapt to these circumstances, but that framework was essential for kind of what followed after a long period of kind of global conflict and bloodshed. Let me turn to Mitchell for the second of the questions I was going to have, because Mitchell's got, I think, a cool description of Mitchell is that he is George Kennan's successor in that position that he had as policy planning staff. And
No. We all labored in his shadow.
yes, yeah.
All right.
But Kennan, of course, is identified with the concept, the strategy of containment, which was essentially an answer to the question, what do you do when authoritarian states will not go along with the preferred American strategy, which is integration. That when states, our grand strategy is we want to integrate states into the system, but they may not be ready, so we may need to contain them till internal processes play out. Now we have two authoritarian states currently, great powers, Russia and China. Neither of them is offering a revolutionary alternative vision of what international order should be. So it's not back to kind of Trotsky, Lenin, or even Stalin. And as my colleague here, Matt Rajansky, says, in Russia, he's the head of the Kennan Institute, Putin has given up on the West and integrating in, but 150 million Russians have not given up on that. In China, China has succeeded largely by integrating into the system, but they want to do it on their own terms, adapt the rules, et cetera. So how should we think about whether these two great powers that have been outside the system can either be integrated into it, or will that, the realists, and I noted kind of that as the alternative kind of big theory of international relations, there's big debates about whether we're headed for a World War I type crack-up with China in the middle of this century or not. How do you see these issues?
Thanks for that softball there, Rob. So let me get to the answer in sort of a roundabout way. And first of all, Russia right now has about 40 million fewer people than Pakistan does. It's the only great power whose population is shrinking. And so it's just interesting, right? And we know that given mortality, Mr. Putin isn't going to be around forever. So part of thinking longer term about Russia, in my view, is to think about how we hold the fort with those 150 million Russians and try to prepare for the day when Russia may be willing to have a different type of conversation, a different relationship with us. One thing that I proposed when I was at policy planning was if we really wanted to help ourselves and hurt Russia, we'd change our immigration policy to allow 100,000 Russians with PhDs to have automatic American citizenship, 100,000 Sergey Brins coming over to the United States. It'd be a brain drain for them and a big boost for us. Okay, you haven't read about that in the headline, so you can see what happened to that policy memo. But there are ways of thinking about how to contain, manage, and prepare for the day, because I do think integration is the goal. But if I can go back to the first issue of the panel, which is the world order, whether it's truly Wilsonian or not, it seems to me that there's a crisis of confidence in the world order more than there really is any fundamental change to the world order as I see it. And perhaps it's because I live outside of Washington these days. But it reminds me of what financial analysts used to say about company stock valuations, is that there may be some underlying volatility, but the fundamentals are sound. So you look at the world order today, and the fundamentals are sound. Okay, even look here in the United States, where there is an unprecedented high support, according to the Chicago Council, recent polling, American support for alliances, American support for globalization, American support for free trade, okay, in the 70% range. This is a year and a half after President Trump was elected. So what does that tell us? I mean, it's interesting, to say the least. There's an increase in defense spending by the United States, and now President Trump has done something that at least every American administration, going back to Senator Mansfield's time, has wanted from the Europeans, which is increase your defense spending. Okay, and that appears to be heading as well. So again, it's hard to see where all the overwrought anxiety is, and I'm being a little coy here. We know because the president is disruptive, and he uses language that offends at times, and he disrupts, and he even demoralizes people at times. But the fundamentals, what type of system that's lasted this long could be so undone in a year and a half? It wouldn't be a successful system at all. So again, I just think that some perspective on that is called for. And I just want to mention the values, because this, again, I think in my mind, and I think a lot of people's mind, it gets back to Woodrow Wilson and the values of human rights and democracy promotion. And unfortunately, in my view, the president doesn't talk very much about human rights and democracy promotion. Neither, for the record, did President Obama. But Trump does have two values that I think are really important to recognize. One, Rob mentioned, which is a powerful assertion of U.S. sovereignty, whether it's a Make America Great Again slogan, whether it's opposition to the International Criminal Court. You see it, you hear it, you feel it whenever he talks about foreign policy or even foreigners in general. But the second is not been, I think, is focused on, and it's a question of fairness. And that's my term, not his. But I think he sees defense spending by our European allies as a question of fairness, where there have been free riding on the United States. I think he sees trade deals is unfair to the American workers. We've been taken advantage of. And whether it's trade or tariffs, whether it's intellectual property protection, intellectual property theft on the part of China, These are problems we've known for a long time, but he's calling them out because he's saying they're fundamentally unfair. And why have they persisted for so long? And I would argue it's because we collectively as a nation, led by people here in Washington, decided to make an accommodation to certain countries during the Cold War. And then after the Cold War, we decided to make an accommodation to China because we bet on their integration. Okay, and when that bet didn't look like it was going to pay off, Bob Zellick got up and gave a speech about responsible stakeholders to remind them about the bet. And here we are 10, 15 years further on, and the bet doesn't look like it's going to pay off for us, at least not in the way we thought. And so the president, in the most charitable perspective I can give, is trying to reset, to recalibrate what that basic bargain is. What does the new world order look like? It's not that he wants to undo it, he just wants a better bargain for the United States, because the accommodations, while worthy and notable and resulting in peace between great states for so many years, we've now moved on to a different place.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's much to be said for that perspective, but
You can stop there if you want.
you know, another Wilson alum, John Eikenberry, who teaches at Princeton, says that the key to American success in post-World War II was channeling American interests through institutions and norms which made American power kind of less threatening, more legitimate to others, and accounts for this conundrum that he wrote about here at Wilson, which is like, why didn't the whole world seek to balance American power in the 1990s when we were the sole superpower? And the answer has to do with this embedded quality of power. I think that, and there, you know, we've got real historians in the room here. You know, we have one on the panel. You know, talking about, you know, the pendular aspect of American policy. The characterization you gave, I think that has been there. I think, and there's nothing, you know, per se you can't, you know, you can't argue with it, but it's really in a context where that reaches the point where some of the framework begins to undermine or erode some of the framework. I think that's really the nub right now.
Yeah, you know, the word you didn't use that I think John used a lot is legitimacy, okay? And so our power has been legitimized because it's been channeled into international organizations where we enforce a rules-based order. Based on process, we don't prejudge the outcome, but everybody gets a fair shake. And I agree that there is a danger with the president's rhetoric.
Yeah.
And so I do acknowledge that, but you know, we're just a year and a half into this presidency, and I'm hoping that it will get better. NAFTA, President broke it up, but reconstituted it. You know, NATO is still together despite the Article 5 statement. So again, it's very difficult not to get distracted or demoralized by some of these statements, and it's hard to know what's real and what isn't. As Kathy's point is, you wake up one morning, you just don't know. But the international order, I think, has a lot more resiliency than we think.
Kathy, you've spent more time with Sergei Lavrov than anyone else practically, and you've met Putin any number of times, and you've been to China to boot. I mean, what's your take on sort of whether the authoritarian great powers, whether they will challenge the order or can be accommodated within it?
I imagine that for people in China and in Beijing and in Moscow, that there's partly a sense of looking to see what's going to happen next, because the problem with, in a sense where we are now, and perhaps especially where the US is that you have process and outcome, and we're into outcomes without process. So particularly the nature of the administration is that they go for outcomes that may be very positive, but they don't necessarily follow the processes that existed before. And your point about the rules-based order is that they expect in Moscow and Beijing and elsewhere that the US, above all, will be the ones following the process and leading to an outcome. So when you kind of go around that and go straight to outcome, it's very challenging. And I imagine that they will be trying to work out exactly what this means, because it may seem as you know, in any presidency or prime minister or whatever, you feel like they've been here for a long, long time. It's actually quite early days if you're studying them from afar to try and establish patterns and rhythms and process. And I think that's probably what they're busy doing right now.
we're going to go to the audience, but just wanted to give Trig an opportunity to weigh in on these contemporary issues and this formulation, "We live in the house that Wilson built." I think if it was in one of your courses, you would put that in quotes and then put "discuss" next to it. But
I'd invite Anne Marie to my class and hope
Yeah.
she showed up.
Yeah.
Well, let me just say, I think we can, and I think I'll be able to both echo and push back a little bit on some of the previous comments. I think we can learn two lessons from our study of Wilson for our contemporary moment. The first is he realized back in, certainly 1917, but I think even earlier than that, before there was Twitter, before there was the internet, before there were cyber attacks, before there was air travel, he realized that sovereignty is a chimera. It's an illusion. There is no absolute sovereignty. Even then, affairs were too interrelated, too interconnected. You cannot control your own destiny as a nation alone, any more than any individual in society, no matter how powerful, can control their own destiny outside of society. I think I go too far sometimes in maybe denigrating the post-war order that Mitchell finds so resilient. Certainly something is better than nothing, and there have been wonderful successes since 1945. But I think that brings us to the other lesson that Wilson can lend to us, which is that Wilson should have compromised, not for the sake of compromise, but to at least launch the experiment, to launch something bold, even if it wasn't exactly as he had hoped. I think his vision, his house would have been built sooner, stronger, better amenities, would be in less danger of falling down or sacked by vandals. I think even with a flawed head start, we would be farther along in this experiment of international organization in its broadest sense than we are. And I do think, Mitchell's right. There's a crisis of confidence. And one of the things we can learn from Wilson is how powerful promoting norms and values really can be, and how important. But the confidence only matters if the will is there. And I think there's more than just a crisis of confidence in this country. I think there is a crisis of will. We have for many decades wanted or said we want to maintain a rules-based order, but to Kathy's point, often not played by the rules. Or at the very least, written the rules with very little input from other players. And I think this bet on integration that we made at the end of the Cold War would have paid out more handsomely had we really been focused on fairness and not just our own advantage.
Good. Floor is now open for questions. If speakers would please identify themselves. Yes, right. Yeah. Yes, the first question. And
I'm Michael Davis, and I'm a new fellow here at the Wilson Center. I'm just wondering, on Mitchell's point about fairness and the point that was just made, closing point about fairness, isn't the problem for Trump, there's a lot of support for sovereignty around the world. They want to define it in different ways, but that's there. But isn't the problem Trump has is that the fairness problem is actually quite the opposite of what he thinks it is? That the U.S. is the most privileged country virtually on earth. It controls the rules of the game. It controls the currency of the world. Pretty much it's the richest country on earth and has, in effect, if I were from any of the other countries, I would say the U.S. is unfairly privileged. And I think that was the sort of part of the closing point that was just made here. And isn't that the difficulty in selling this Trump mission on the fairness front?
the political scientists refer to the benign hegemon, and there's some question about how benign it is, I guess. So, Mitchell, do you want to?
Sure. I think one response to that is that the United States has earned its privilege over the years by what we've done, how hard we've worked, how we've integrated millions of people from around the world as immigrants, our values, our market system. Does it give us an advantage over others? Yes, I think it absolutely does. I think the president believes that it wasn't reflected in some of the arrangements that we had with other countries. He saw wealthy European countries spending 1%, 1.5% on their defense when we were spending 3%, 4%, and 5%. He didn't think that was fair. He saw tariff barriers that other countries were imposing on American goods, whereas we were welcoming those countries' goods. It's easier to start a business if you're a foreign national in the United States than it is in virtually every other country around the world. So I think those are the fairness issues. Do we have structural advantages over the countries? Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. Some of them earned and some of them with the benevolence of Providence, as Thomas Jefferson would say. So, but I think in terms of fairness, the president sees our international arrangements as not benefiting us. And I think we made those accommodations willingly, knowingly during the Cold War and afterwards with China. And I think the president is saying it's time to rethink that right now.
Okay. The gentleman,
Is this on?
yes.
I'm John Cloud, and I'd like to get back to the house that Wilson made and ask y'all what you think about what, to me, I believe is the longest lasting legacy of Wilson, which was that, and he wasn't alone in this, but he was a member of a tiny group of white men and the occasional white women like Gertrude Bell, who felt entitled at Versailles to draw lines on a series of maps and create so much of the sources of instability in the modern world. In the case of Europe, they redrew the lines and invented countries, and as has been talked about before, created geographic and cultural winners and losers, which was a direct trigger to World War II. In the case of the European colonies, they largely refused to make any changes in any of the colonial lines with reference to self-determination or whatever. And in the case of the Ottoman Empire, they carved it up with white man straight lines, made these fictive states, gave them names like Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Transjordan, etc., which have then become the source of incredible instability up to this very day and who knows how far into the future.
Thank you.
I'll take that. This again gets back to the importance of the League in Wilson's vision. He was under and the folly of equating self-determination with his vision. He was under no illusions that Paris was going to get things right. The League was so important to him because he knew at the end of a conflict like this, and that in future conflicts, and as the world evolved, there were going to be mistakes that would need to be adjusted. One of the reasons he was, to say he was a supporter of the mandate system is maybe a simplification. He had to make some compromises on the structure of the mandate system. But one of the reasons one of his hopes for it was that even though against his wishes it had left several colonial territories in the hands of imperial powers, it was now written into international law and structures were in place to hold the conduct of those powers accountable to international scrutiny. It was both a normative and a practical, if the will was there and if the League was strong, assault on the very idea of empire. And I think that's something that we have to keep in mind. Were the mandates well drawn? No, I would say not. Wilson actually had very little influence on drawing most of those lines. But I think it's crucial to remember that Wilson himself knew this settlement was going to be imperfect, and that's why a deliberative league he actually did try very hard to make sure that the assembly and not just the council had a lot of voice in that league, could address these difficulties and flaws as they became more apparent over time.
Yes. And then Elliot.
Barry Wood, former short-term scholar. I too would like to ask about Versailles, because there was so much enthusiasm when President Wilson sailed to Europe. It's extraordinary to read the literature on how much hope was placed upon him, and yet it diminished so rapidly. So my question is, how would you assess his performance at Versailles? Was he completely outdone by these wily Europeans? And I have in mind here the question of Czechoslovakia in specific, because when Masaryk was able to mobilize the Wilson administration to accept Czechoslovak independence just 100 years ago right now, that really upset the whole dissolution of the Austrian Empire.
I'll take that one again. I actually think if you read the transcripts of the negotiations at Paris, it is really difficult to make the argument that Wilson was anything but the most accomplished negotiator there. It is very easy to look back on, let me start even further back. Wilson's greatest mistake was from February 1918 up until the end of the war to refuse to clarify his post-war plans. He had good reasons for it. He knew that any statement he made would, while he was distracted, just be a banner out here for Republicans, his Republican opposition, to take pot shots at. And so he wanted to hold his cards close to his vest. His other reason was that he recognized the shape of the settlement was going to, in some regard, have to reflect the facts on the ground at the armistice. And in some ways, your Czechoslovakia example is a case in point. That was a de facto situation that was brought to him. Unfortunately, what that allowed people all around Europe to do is invest their own individual or tribalistic vision, invest his rhetoric with their own individual tribalistic vision. And that happened in the United States as well. People who thought that he must mean this or that. He must mean a free Ireland. He must mean a free India. He must mean this or that. And he never corrected anybody, or he made the choice to remain vague rather than very clearly tell people, no, this is going to be messy, and there are going to be trade-offs for everyone involved, because this is the worst catastrophe that has befallen any of these people in decades, or in ever, perhaps. What he was able to salvage from that situation, I think, is truly remarkable. I mean, without getting into a discussion of the League fight right now, imagine if the United States had joined the League of Nations. The European powers didn't want a League of Nations. They absolutely did not want a League of Nations. They had to accept a League of Nations. And Wilson made sure that that was the very first order of business at the conference, that everything else at the conference depended on getting that done. They didn't want a mandate system. They wanted to take over Germany's colonies and the pieces of the Ottoman Empire. Wilson didn't get a perfect mandate system through, but he made sure that there was international oversight in his vision, with a stronger league, with America working as a partner, to slowly dismantle colonialism across the world. None of this is to say Wilson wasn't racist and blind and applying his principles selectively, but he was a master negotiator. He knew when he had an advantage, and more importantly, he knew when he did not have the advantage. And many of the things that Wilson is taken to task for, it's hard to see how he could have made different decisions. He needed Japan in the League of Nations. They refused to give up the Shandong Peninsula. The best he could do was extract a promise from them that they would give it up later. And in fact, within 5 years, they kept their promise. So I think he accomplished an amazing amount at Paris. And many, many people disagree with me.
I'm afraid our time is up for this panel. Please join me in thanking them for their excellent presentations. Thank you.